The hidden reason people flee the Great Plains. The last grocery store for 60 miles just locked its doors. Out here, that means driving across county lines for milk, through towns where gas stations stand empty and the schools haven't rung a bell in years. This land once fed the world, so how did the heart of America become its quietest place? Humans learned to survive deserts, jungles, tundras, but on the Great Plains, the land of endless soil and wind, we somehow built prosperity that erased its own people. The ground still grows wheat, the turbines still spin, yet the towns are vanishing. To understand how success turned into silence, we need to go back to when the grass itself looked like a promise and the horizon meant hope instead of distance. Section 1. The Promise of Endless Land. They called it free land. In 1862, the Homestead Act promised 160 acres to anyone willing to claim it, build a home, and work the soil for 5 years. Word spread quickly through railroad pamphlets, newspaper ads, and the whispers of opportunity carried by letters home. From Germany, Scandinavia, and crowded factories in the East, families came chasing freedom, fleeing debts and landlords, believing the prairie would become their own private kingdom. From the train windows, it looked endless, rolling seas of grass, the horizon too wide to fit in memory. Government surveyors and land agents spoke of deep black soil, rich beyond imagining. For the first settlers stepping from rough-hewn wagons, it must have felt like touching the edge of potential itself. They saw this as blank land waiting for civilization. But the plains was no blank slate. It was already inhabited, both by native nations with millennia of adaptation behind them, and by an ecology that tolerated only those who listened to its rhythms. Settlers, unaware of this unspoken rule, thought persistence alone could tame the land. With little timber around, houses were built from sod, chunks of grass and earth peeled from the ground, stacked like bricks. It was shelter against a sky that could turn from calm to deadly in minutes. Winds rattled thin walls. Summers scorched wheat before it formed. Winters buried entire homesteads in snowdrifts higher than doorframes. Rain might bless one year and vanish the next. Still, they wrote home about the future. One farmer in Kansas described a country needing nothing but hands. What he didn't write was how his wife sat inside their earth house for days, her world narrowed to the sound of the wind. Loneliness wore people down as much as drought or blizzard. There were no forests to muffle the air, no neighbors close enough to break the silence. The horizon that promised freedom soon became a reminder of isolation. Railroads carved grids across the plains, promising connection to markets and towns. Each line gave birth to communities dotted every few miles, grain elevators, general stores, and hopes that trains would always stop there. For a moment, optimism ruled. Yet the optimism existed largely because most settlers hadn't experienced a dry year yet. They believed rainfall would follow the plow, that cultivation itself could change the climate. It was an illusion, but one powerful enough to fill the landscape with fragile towns and fragile dreams. In their letters, settlers often compared the plains to oceans. The grass waved like waves, the wind hummed but offered no rest. They tried to plant trees as windbreaks, but the seedlings withered under sun and dust. Fields stretched outward into limits they didn't yet recognize. Survival demanded adaptation. They saved rainwater in barrels, shared tools, and learned to preserve food through the long winters. Some made it work, at least for a while. But others simply vanished, their claims reclaimed by grass and sky. Government policy encouraged belief. Politicians needed the plains to be fertile, rail companies needed it to be filled. Brochures portrayed prosperous farms and cooperative sunlight, but behind that imagery were failed crop seasons, mortgages unpaid, and families quietly packing their belongings onto wagons heading east. For every success story of endurance and wealth, there were 10 stories of exhaustion. Native peoples saw this transformation with quiet clarity. For centuries, they lived within the climate's extremes by moving with the seasons, by hunting, trading, and adapting. Settlers arrived with a vision of control, not coexistence. They plowed under the prairie's deep-rooted grasses, unaware those roots held the soil during droughts. When rain ceased and winds rose, there would be no defenses left, but that lesson was still decades away. For now, newcomers believed they had won. And yet, even amid hardship, small joys defined life. A neighbor's rare visit, a letter from back home, a harvest dance when weather allowed. faith and endurance became currency. Churches doubled as schools and meeting halls. Marriage rates soared, birth rates even more. Every child born on the plains was proof the dream continued. But by the century's end, many realized the promise came with a price the brochures never mentioned: endless labor for uncertain reward. Some who stayed learned to read the land differently. They rotated crops, stored grain, shared wells, and treated rain like treasure. Those who refused adaptation left ruins behind: a broken plow, a collapsed sod house, fragments of pottery found decades later merging back into soil. The Great Plains absorbed its failures swiftly. The grass returned, erasing evidence faster than memory. The settlers had thought they'd found eternity. What they found instead was fragility wearing the mask of abundance. The horizon still looked infinite, but its generosity had limits. Success was possible, sure, but it rested on ground that was far less stable than it seemed. The people who stayed were the ones who understood that survival out here wasn't about conquering the land. It was about listening to it. By the dawn of the 20th century, enough families had endured to call the experiment a success. Towns dotted the prairie, rail lines shimmered in heat, and the phrase "breadbasket of the world" began to appear in newspapers. But beneath that triumph, the pattern was already set. Prosperity born from exhaustion, abundance masking vulnerability. The system worked for a while, but it was built on fragile ground, and soon the sky itself would turn against them. Section 2. The Boom of Abundance. The sound of progress on the Great Plains used to be metallic: steel plows slicing through prairie sod, steam engines howling across flat horizons, grain elevators clanking to life before sunrise. After the hardships of homesteading, this noise meant triumph. By the early 190s, something remarkable was happening. The Great Plains had become the productive heart of America. The same land that once tested endurance now seemed tamed by machinery and optimism. The agricultural revolution reached the prairie like a fever. Cheap steel and the invention of the tractor allowed farmers to cultivate more acres than ever before. The railroads, radiating out like veins across the continent, gave isolated communities a lifeline to national markets. Elevators rose beside railroad tracks, towering over young towns that formed in the gaps between lines, each 10 miles apart, so the next shipping point was always within a day's wagon ride. Suddenly, those towns pulsed with energy. General stores sold flour milled from local wheat. Banks opened, schools filled, churches sprouted on every horizon. Small grain elevators became landmarks for approaching travelers, the only vertical break in an ocean of grass. The Midwest's advance guard declared victory over the wilderness. For the people who had endured the first decades of disappointment, this was vindication. New towns in Kansas, Nebraska, and the Dakotas placed bets on prosperity by erecting ornate courthouses and wide brick main streets. Train depots hummed with optimism. In the evenings, you could hear fiddles at community dances and see lanterns swinging outside barns during harvest parties. This was no longer frontier, it was a civilization in full bloom. World War I supercharged the momentum. As Europe's fields turned into battlefields, America's breadbasket became indispensable. Wheat prices tripled, every acre plowed seemed patriotic. Farmers answered the call by breaking even more prairie. Tractors roared where bison had grazed just decades earlier. For the first time, success felt guaranteed. But abundance has a strange way of masking danger. The new wealth built elegant homes, but not resilience. During wet years, yields soared, reinforcing faith in technology and endless productivity. The banks encouraged expansion with easy credit. Communities expanded schools, water towers, and telephone lines, assuming the boom would last forever. The social fabric tied these scattered places together. Even in isolation, people found comfort through connection. County fairs became civic holidays, part harvest competition, part reunion. Small-town newspapers chronicled births, barn dances, and rainfall. Baseball teams formed where grass was short enough to play. Church picnics served as social currency. Girls rolled up their sleeves to serve pie. Boys leaned against fence rails, bragging about combines. It was a world confident enough to laugh at its own vastness. The plains, for once, didn't feel empty. From the northern counties of Montana to the Red River Valley, population density peaked. Families had children by the dozens to help with labor. A farmer might know every face within a 10-mile radius. Trains brought mail, news, and travelers. Silk dresses from Chicago appeared in shop windows in tiny towns that had existed for barely a decade. Hope was tangible. You could hold it in a seed sack or see it reflected in a banker's grin. Meanwhile, ranchers adapted their own rhythm of modernity. Wire fencing and windmills allowed cattle to range farther, and refrigerated railcars let beef travel east without spoiling. Packing houses thrived in Kansas City and Omaha. Grain brokers made fortunes predicting rainfall. The Great Plains was no longer just a margin of the map. It sat at the center of global food supply. Yet even as the region thrived, the warning signs were embedding themselves in the soil. Overcultivation had stripped away the prairie's deep-rooted grasses. Mechanized plows left earth loose and exposed. But in a decade of good rain, no one noticed. A farmer with a shiny new combine wasn't thinking about erosion. He was calculating how many more bushels he could produce next season. If there was one word to define this era, it was faith. Faith in expansion, in technology, and in land that seemed endlessly forgiving. Every ribbon of track laid down, every silo that touched the clouds, seemed to confirm that humankind could bend geography to willpower. The human cost of ambition stayed hidden behind the spectacle of success. Working dawn to dusk became normal. Families mortgaged their future for new machinery, believing more steel meant more security. For women, isolation intensified. Even as communities grew, roles remained confined. Letters reveal subtle exhaustion, pride tangled with burnout, religious hope intertwined with the quiet dread of debt. But no one dared voice doubt. The plains had to work. It wasn't just farmland anymore, it was a national symbol, proof that grit could turn grass into gold. The county seats acted like capitals of this new empire of wheat. Grain elevators wore the logos of powerful cooperatives: Central Grain, Farmers Union, Great Plains Milling. Trucks lined up for miles during harvest. Kids skipped school to help shovel wheat. Life revolved around yield reports and rainfall predictions. In that golden window between 191 and 1929, it all seemed permanent. Per capita incomes in some farming counties rivaled industrial cities. Banks sponsored theaters, schools produced orchestras. When visitors arrived from the east, they marveled at the energy of these small towns, how houses, churches, and depots seemed to rise from the soil itself. They left convinced the plains had finally found its identity. But beneath the pride lay fragility. Every success deepened dependence on one narrow source of wealth: the land. When crop prices began to waver after the war, so did certainty. The same trains carrying full grain cars also carried rumors about market drops, dust storms in Oklahoma, and fields turning gray where green once ruled. Farmers believed these were only temporary setbacks. They weren't. What nobody yet understood was that the soil itself was changing. Every year, plows dug deeper, breaking the natural armor that had kept this land alive for millennia. The roots that once held moisture like a sponge were gone. Still, life went on as if abundance were invincible. New post offices opened, electricity spread, and radio signals carried national news into prairie kitchens. The people felt connected to the nation's rhythm, unaware that connection worked both ways. When markets crashed, the shock would travel back faster than the wind. By the late 192s, optimism began to thin. Crops failed in patches, winds blew stronger, and debts grew heavier. Some bankers quietly withdrew credit. Others doubled down, gambling that the next harvest would erase the risk. In farmhouses from Texas to North Dakota, neighbors reassured one another that the rains would return. They didn't. Within a few short years, everything the Great Plains had built, its towns, its confidence, its sense of permanence, would confront an enemy older and stronger than any machine: the wind. The same horizon that had once promised endless opportunity would soon turn black with dust, erasing roads, choking livestock, and driving families to abandon the very land that had defined them. The age of abundance was ending, and what came next would prove how thin the line really was between prosperity and collapse. Section 3: War with the Wind, the Dust Bowl. The wind came first, then the color changed. By 1932, farmers in western Kansas and Oklahoma began to notice the sky turning brown on clear afternoons. The air felt heavy, like breathing through wool. Dust gathered on windowsills, seeped through cracks in barn doors, and settled on dinner tables before families could lift their forks. What had been the nation's breadbasket was becoming unrecognizable. It wasn't just a bad season, it was an unraveling. Years of plowing had torn away the deep roots of native grasses, leaving soil loose, naked, and waiting. When the Great Depression hit and crop prices collapsed, farmers tried to make up for lost income by planting more. More acres meant more exposure. Then the rains stopped. From 1931 to 1937, much of the southern plains endured one of the worst droughts in recorded history. Entire months passed without measurable rainfall. Corn wilted before reaching knee height. Wheat fields, once green waves under summer sun, turned ashy and brittle. Ranchers shot cattle they couldn't feed or sold them for pennies a head. Families prayed for rain that never came. The wind began to roar louder. It stripped the lifeless soil and carried it across counties, states, sometimes all the way to the Atlantic. In May 1934, a single storm dumped an estimated 350 million tons of topsoil across the eastern United States. Dust reached the White House and drifted onto ships docked in New York Harbor. On the plains, noon could turn to night in minutes. Farmers called them black blizzards. Some storms stretched hundreds of miles wide. People tied ropes between their houses and barns so they wouldn't lose their way in the dark. Dust settled in lungs, causing what doctors began calling dust pneumonia. Children coughed up black phlegm. Chickens suffocated in their coops. A single spark could ignite the dry earth like tinder. Inside the small frame houses, families worked out survival routines. Wet sheets hung over doors. Dishes were stacked upside down. Mothers placed damp cloths over their sleeping children's mouths. Radios crackled with warnings and weather bulletins that always seemed too late. And still, people tried to believe it would end soon. There was no quick end. Entire counties in Kansas, Oklahoma, Colorado, and Texas lost more than half their population. Between 193 and 194, nearly 500,000 people migrated westward, most heading for California. They loaded everything onto Model A Fords or wagons piled with mattresses, chairs, and chickens. Families slept by the roadside, hoping the next harvest town would still need hands. Photographers from federal relief agencies captured images that defined the era. A woman shielding her children's faces as the dust swirled. A line of cars stranded under a sky gone black. Men's hats crusted with dirt from their own fields. To the rest of America, these images looked like proof that civilization was cracking. Out on the plains, it just looked like Tuesday. The tragedy wasn't only physical, it was emotional. This was land people had believed in, prayed over, and built identities upon. Abandoning it felt like failure. Many resisted until there was nothing left to resist. In one diary from eastern Colorado, a farmer wrote, "We've been fighting the wind for months. It wins every time." The migrants who fled became known as Okies, though many came from Kansas, Texas, or even Nebraska. In California, they found suspicion instead of welcome. Locals saw them as competitors, not survivors. Camped in irrigation ditches or on the edges of orchards, they picked fruit for wages barely enough to eat. They were exiles from the idea of self-reliance, the very dream that had drawn their grandparents west. Back on the plains, those who stayed faced surreal isolation. With neighbors gone and farms abandoned, silence replaced community. Foreclosure sales became social events, grim and necessary. Auction blocks were set up beside county offices. Entire farms sold for the price of a used car. Some owners stayed to work their own land as tenants under banks they'd once borrowed from. Then came April 14, 1935, Palm Sunday. The day would be remembered as Black Sunday, the climax of the Dust Bowl era. Morning began calm, almost gentle. Families left windows open to let in rare, cool air. Children played outside. By afternoon, the western horizon turned copper red. A wall of dust half a mile high rolled toward them at 60 miles per hour. People ran for their homes, sealed windows with rags, and crouched in darkness as static electricity snapped through the storm. When the sky cleared hours later, topsoil inches thick covered kitchens and beds. It was as if the earth itself had shifted indoors. The government couldn't ignore it anymore. President Roosevelt sent advisors and agronomists to the region. What they saw looked apocalyptic: fences buried, towns half hidden under dunes, cattle skeletons scattered in dry creek beds. Out of desperation came innovation. The Soil Conservation Service was founded in 1935, launching the first major federal campaign to remake agricultural practice. Contour plowing, strip cropping, and windbreak planting became official policy. Farmers learned to seed clover and wheatgrass to anchor soil, to let fields rest between harvests. The Civilian Conservation Corps planted over 200 million trees across the plains, what became known as the Great Plains Shelter Belt, a living wall stretching from North Dakota to Texas. Change came slowly, but it came. By 1938, rainfall returned to parts of Kansas and the Dakotas. Farmers who had adjusted their methods saw their soil stay put. Yet not everyone recovered. Some counties never regained their pre-depression populations. Towns bypassed by new highways remained ghostly, their schools and churches left to the wind. Even after nature eased its grip, the cultural scar remained. The Dust Bowl became a lesson carved into national memory about the limits of optimism and control. The very technology that had symbolized progress, tractors, steel plows, mechanical drills, had also helped destroy the ecosystem they depended upon. The survivors never forgot. They spoke of the wind like an old adversary. Some refused to sell their land, swearing to die where their parents had failed. Others taught their children to respect the rules of dryland farming: don't plow too deep, don't trust the rain. The sensibility of caution replaced the exuberance of earlier generations. By the dawn of World War II, tractors hummed again, but with restraint. The land looked healed from a distance, yet everyone knew the recovery was conditional. The Great Plains couldn't be conquered, only borrowed from each harvest a temporary truce. That truth lingered in the memories of those who rebuilt. The feeling of sealing windows against a dark noon, the ache of leaving friends behind, the taste of grit in bread. They had learned that abundance could vanish overnight, and that even across millions of acres, there was nowhere to hide when the wind decided to claim its due. And though conservation brought stability, it also revealed another truth: any system that required constant vigilance wasn't truly secure. The Dust Bowl ended only because nature allowed it to. Humanity had survived, but not triumphed. The land could be tamed for a season, but its limits were carved deeper than anyone wanted to admit. For now, green fields reappeared, and combines rolled once more. But beneath that fragile calm, the plains waited, quietly reminding those who stayed how easily the wind could return. Section 4: The Great Plains and the Ogalala Miracle. After the Dust Bowl, the Great Plains entered a long, quiet recovery. Families returned to find grass reclaiming what the wind had stripped bare. Shelter belts, the trees planted by the government, had grown tall enough to break the gusts, and new practices kept the soil steady beneath their boots. On the surface, the battle seemed won, but below the ground was a different kind of revolution waiting to begin. In the late 194s, an invisible ocean became the region's salvation: the Ogallala Aquifer. Stretching from South Dakota to Texas, it held water laid down during the Ice Age, trapped under layers of sand and clay. For generations, that water had been unreachable. Then came the turbine pump. Scientists called it engineering genius. Farmers called it deliverance. With diesel engines and steel casing, wells could pull up thousands of gallons an hour. Suddenly, the plains, a dryland empire that had always lived at the mercy of the sky, found a new god underground. It began modestly, one well on one farm, then more followed. By the early 195s, irrigation rigs dotted the horizon like mechanical insects, spinning arcs of silver water over fields that had once died thirsty. Corn replaced wheat because it could now drink deeply. Towns that had barely survived the Depression began to stir again. Grain bins filled, banks reopened, and the word miracle started appearing in local papers. There was a new kind of confidence, scientific, technological, almost messianic. Rainfall no longer mattered. The Ogalala was endless, or so it seemed. A farmer could finally plan with certainty, predict yield per acre, chart profit in bushels, calculate growth instead of gamble for it. The maps of dryland farming were redrawn overnight. Kansas became a sea of irrigation circles, perfectly green against the pale tan of prairie. Aerial photographs looked almost artistic, geometry replacing chaos. That water changed everything. It fed crops that fed cattle that fed the nation. Feedlots expanded across western Kansas and the Texas Panhandle, their lights glowing on the edge of towns that had once gone dark. Trucking routes followed, and so did fertilizer plants, cooperatives, and meatpacking jobs. Post-war optimism, already surging across the country, found in the Great Plains its most vivid expression. The Dust Bowl's memory faded, replaced by new prosperity. By the 196s, irrigation technology had become cultural identity. Pivot sprinklers twirled like slow-motion ballet. Adolescents learned to drive pickup trucks between center pivots as part of summer chores. Crop dusters scrawled contrails across the hot sky. The economy surged, and so did population numbers, small but steady gains that made towns feel alive again. Drive-in theaters flickered open, high school football stadiums filled, new churches broke ground. The descendants of those who'd once fled felt vindicated. They had finally tamed the plains. But it was a borrowed triumph. Every gallon pumped was drawn from a supply that barely refilled. The aquifer wasn't a river, it was a vault sealed millennia ago, replenished drop by drop in quantities too small for modern demand. Hydrologists began warning of declines before the public even understood the scale of extraction. In some counties, water levels dropped 10 feet a year, but as yields rose and profits followed, most farmers shrugged. The well still ran, the grass stayed green. Why panic? Through the 197s, the miracle intensified. Diesel engines improved, and deeper wells tapped what seemed like bottomless reserves. Government loans encouraged expansion. Fields doubled in size, while the number of farmers began to shrink. The emphasis shifted from survival to efficiency, a subtle but profound change. A man who once needed 3 neighbors to harvest his land could now do it all with machines and groundwater. Prosperity sounded like the electric hum of pumps running through the night, engines echoing down empty county roads. By the time satellites began observing irrigation from space, the plains looked transformed, an illuminated grid of productivity visible even in darkness. Towns added water towers, schools raised mascots named after harvests, and local slogans celebrated faith in the future. Yet beneath the optimism lay a creeping unease. When a well went dry, another was drilled. Each success postponed the reckoning. Then came the scientists' maps, streaks of red cutting across western Kansas, the Panhandle, and parts of Nebraska. Warnings that the Ogalala might not last another century. Farmers listened, nodded, then went back to their fields. What choice did they have? Entire economies depended on what came out of that aquifer. Some regions tried to adapt early. Kansas introduced the first local conservation zones, farmers agreeing to limit pumping in exchange for lower taxes and longer groundwater life. The results were promising. Wells stabilized, the pace of decline slowed. But elsewhere, deep aquifers dropped below suction levels, pumps drew air, and irrigation rigs stood silent under the sun. When diesel prices soared in the late 197s, the financial strain deepened. The same miracle that once ensured success now demanded sacrifice. The paradox of the Ogalala was everywhere. It created wealth, but also dependency. It turned dust into corn, but tethered prosperity to a finite resource. And it changed the psychology of the Great Plains. People believed in control again, just as their grandparents had believed in rain. But control was an illusion built on borrowed time. By the 198s, subtle signs of stress reappeared. Towns that had grown during the irrigation boom started shrinking. Young people left for cities, drawn by easier money and less uncertainty. Older residents stayed behind to maintain irrigation systems and aging water rights that grew more valuable each year. County extension offices preached conservation, while banks quietly foreclosed on overleveraged farms. The hum of pumps that once sounded like progress began to sound like debt. Everywhere, the landscape bore invisible wounds, subtle depressions where aquifers had collapsed, fields reverting to dryland crops, reservoirs shrinking under late summer sun. Farmers traded stories of wells that once produced hundreds of gallons a minute now struggling to fill a ditch. They called it falling water, the slow descent of hope measured in inches. Yet even as awareness spread, the culture held tight to optimism. A Kansas father told his son, "It'll last our lifetime, that's enough." And in a way, he wasn't wrong. For many families, the aquifer sustained another generation of survival, the last one that could rely on abundance without consequence. They built new schools, paved highways, added irrigation sensors linked to satellites, believing technology could stretch time itself. But deep below, the reservoir continued to fall. Hydrologists predicted 206 as the year many regions would run dry entirely. Still, the pumps whirred on. The Great Plains had built its modern identity on water that couldn't return, transforming crisis into infrastructure. The story of the Ogalala wasn't just one of ingenuity, it was a microcosm of the human relationship with the plains: adapt, prosper, ignore, repeat. The aquifer gave back everything the Dust Bowl took, but at a cost no one wanted to calculate. Towns flourished from that buried ocean, yet every harvest quietly drained the future. As the century turned, the miracle looked increasingly fragile. Satellite imagery revealed massive groundwater decline. Environmental groups issued reports calling it unsustainable, but local conversations remained pragmatic. You can't farm philosophy, you farm what the well gives you. Standing in a Kansas field today, you can hear the sound of irrigation arms clicking and water hissing through nozzles, turning slowly under a wide blue sky. It's the sound of life borrowed from the past, written across land that remembers every drought. The Ogallala provided a second chance, an extraordinary reprieve. But like every promise made by this landscape, it came with conditions. The water beneath the Great Plains built a new era of triumph. Yet as each gallon rose to the surface, another inch of tomorrow slipped away. The land could be tamed temporarily. Underneath, the plains kept its silent ledger, measuring every act of survival against the time it could last. And as wells deepen, that balance draws closer to zero. The miracle that saved the plains is now teaching its next lesson: even salvation can run dry. Section 5. Ghost Counties and Vanishing Neighbors. In some Great Plains towns, the loudest noise now is the wind rattling an old stop sign. The last hardware store gone. The school closed 2 years ago. The cafe opens only on Fridays, if enough locals promise to show up. The rest of the week, tumbleweeds roll where kids used to race their bikes. Fewer than 500 people remain in a county that once had 5,000. You can drive an hour without seeing another car, past the faded billboards asking families to stay. The emptiness isn't sudden, it's the slowest kind of disappearance. It started gradually after the irrigation boom leveled off. The 198th farm crisis hit small counties hardest. Loan defaults, foreclosures, auction signs spiked into front yards. Some families left under cover of night, unable to face neighbors the next morning. Others held out, sharpening pencils over balance sheets, hoping that another good harvest might fix what the markets broke. But rural decline, once it starts, works like erosion. It doesn't stop until the landscape is unrecognizable. By the late 199s, population losses became the norm. Census reports turned grim. County after county entered what demographers began calling non-metropolitan decline. Young adults left after high school for colleges east or west, and most didn't come back. The few who stayed often looked after aging parents or family farms that couldn't afford hired help. Churches merged congregations. Schools consolidated. Sometimes an entire county's children crammed into one remaining district. One teacher in western Kansas described locking the door after her final class and hearing only the echo of her own footsteps down the hallway. The building closed forever that Friday. The basketball hoops remained, backboards cracked, symbols of a community that had once been loud enough to fill the bleachers. As the 200s began, local businesses that survived depended on fewer customers spread over wider distances. Gas stations closed when deliveries could no longer justify the trip. Doctors retired without replacements. People began driving 60 miles for groceries, 100 for emergency care. The map didn't change, but the roads felt longer. Economically, agriculture kept expanding, even thriving in production numbers, but the prosperity didn't translate into jobs. Larger farms absorbed smaller ones, and machines replaced farmhands. The The paradox deepened, record harvests and empty towns. When one man's combine can manage 4,000 acres, community becomes a luxury. A Kansas grain elevator manager put it bluntly, "We produce more than ever, but there's no one left to clink a glass with after harvest." This shift carried emotional weight. Saturday night gatherings faded, volunteer fire crews struggled to crew trucks, high school football teams forfeited seasons for lack of players. Local papers shrank to 4 pages, and even obituaries carried names known for decades. In some counties, births fell to single digits per year. Cemeteries expanded quietly. Elderly residents hold on because leaving feels like erasing themselves. They maintain the grass around abandoned schools. They check the mail at tiny post offices, open 3 hours a day. Social connection depends on CB radios and Facebook pages posting about upcoming funerals. Loneliness has become infrastructural, like drought. It stretches across miles. In South Dakota or Nebraska, you'll find counties where the population density falls below 2 people per square mile. Sociologists call them frontier counties. What that really means is that the local government struggles to pave roads or staff an ambulance service. A single deputy might patrol territory larger than some states. When an emergency occurs, help can take an hour. One ranger joked darkly, "Out here, if you break a leg, you better bring a chair." Politicians visit during election cycles, promising broadband access, new grants, revitalization programs. But programs can't reverse geography. Distance costs money, scale kills efficiency. A grocery store in a town of under 800 simply can't survive modern supply chains. Even dollar stores think twice before building where gas stations close for lack of deliveries. The social structure thinned alongside the economy. Bars that once doubled as community centers went dry, literally and figuratively. Without schools or stores, towns lose their anchor institutions, the daily excuses for people to meet. Population decline feeds itself. Fewer neighbors mean less social life, leading more people to leave. One Kansas resident described it as watching your own hometown dissolve in slow motion. Still, beneath the melancholy sits pride. Those who remain see themselves as stewards. Some organize county fairs despite dwindling entries, raising flags beside barns with sagging roofs. They host potlucks in Legion halls too large for the crowd, serving casserole meant for 3 times as many. Their faces light up when anyone new moves in, even if it's just one family buying an old farmhouse with fiber internet. Technology became a double-edged sword. The hope was that broadband might reinvent the rural economy. Remote work, online schools, telemedicine all promised relevance. But infrastructure lagged, and where towers finally went up, they served fields before homes. Farmers installed precision sensors and smart irrigation before towns could get reliable cell service. Machines stayed connected more reliably than people. Automation made farming survivable, but also solitary. GPS tractors don't need hired hands. Harvest no longer means family gatherings. It's one person in an air-conditioned cab texting updates to suppliers hundreds of miles away. Productivity has never been higher, yet conversation has never been scarcer. Even religion, once the heartbeat of the plains, feels the pinch. Some pastors rotate between 3 churches, preaching to a dozen elderly worshippers in each. Baptisms are rare events, funerals mark the calendar. After services, the talk turns to which family might be moving next. By 2025, economists described a clear pattern: counties losing people faster than infrastructure could adapt. Roads crumble faster than budgets can fix them. Hospitals consolidate into regional centers. Highways bypass main streets to save time. The Great Plains no longer functions as a continuous region of settlement. It's a network of isolated survivors separated by vast tracts of efficient farmland. And yet, if you stop at night under the towering stars, there's beauty in that stillness. Grain silos glint under moonlight, wind turbines blink red on distant ridges, coyotes howl where traffic once hummed. It feels almost sacred, the return of quiet to a place long bent under human ambition. Some locals see that as loss, others as restoration. But for those who call it home, the emptiness carries practical pain. Ambulances delayed, schools gone, grocery options vanished. A mother in western Oklahoma said she spends $150 in gas monthly just to keep her kids in sports 2 counties away. She calls it the price of staying. The cycle continues. Without young people, there's no tax base. Without tax base, there's no funding to attract new families. Economists measure it as decline. Residents describe it differently, ghost year by ghost year. Each closure, each farewell dinner leaves another void on the map. Some rural leaders experiment with unconventional fixes, offering free lots to new families, tax credits for remote workers, cooperative daycare centers in old church basements. A few towns manage small revivals, but most accept that stability, not growth, is now the dream. Being the last one left isn't failure, it's loyalty expressed through endurance. Standing in a silent main street at dusk, you can feel that determination. The flag still flies, the cafe still opens on Fridays, the lights still hum in the volunteer fire hall, but the silence after those sounds fade. That's the story. Prosperity once meant fullness, now it means simply not giving up. The people who remain don't expect the plains to change, they just hope not to vanish before the next census counts them. Section 6. When automation replaced density. The combine operator sits alone, 40 feet above the soil, surrounded by screens tracking every seed planted and every kernel collected. Outside, his fields stretch past the horizon, bordered not by fences but by algorithms. The tractor drives itself, guided by satellites, correcting for slope and moisture, adjusting seed depth in real time. Out here, the marvel of modern agriculture isn't abundance, it's solitude. By the early 199s, machines had finally delivered what farmers had long dreamed of: control. Precision agriculture turned guesswork into data, effort into efficiency. Sensors measured humidity, GPS tracked every wheel turn, and yield maps colored fields in gradients of productivity. A single farmer could manage thousands of acres once divided among a dozen families. The technological victory was absolute, but it came with a quiet cost. The people vanished. Where entire neighborhoods once spent harvest season working side by side, now one person covered the same ground without leaving the cab. The roar of engines replaced laughter, and CB radios substituted for conversation. Some joked that farming had become office work with dust. They weren't wrong. Productivity soared. In half a century, output per acre doubled, while the labor force shrank by more than 2/3. Economists celebrated it as efficiency. Rural sociologists called it the separation of livelihood from community. The fewer hands required to feed the world, the emptier those hands became. Automation didn't arrive all at once. It crept in machine by machine. GPS-driven tractors in the 199s, auto-steer combines in the 200s, drones scanning nitrogen deficits by the 201s. By the 202s, autonomous harvesters rolled through fields while farmers monitored from smartphones miles away. A task that once demanded neighbors shouting directions now required silence and strong Wi-Fi. At first, technology felt like salvation. Labor shortages eased, production costs fell, and automation cushioned farms against rising input prices. It made survival possible in places where family size had dwindled and towns could no longer supply workers. But like the Ogallala water before it, this new tool promised stability while eroding the social foundations beneath it. In the 195s, farming communities were mini-republics, thick networks of co-op boards, school committees, and church councils. By the 200s, those committees shrank, meetings moved online, then disappeared. Why gather when there's nothing left to coordinate? Machines don't attend potlucks. The hollowing effect was gradual but relentless. Main streets lost not only stores, but reasons to meet. The cafe that once opened at 5 a.m. for breakfast crowds now served coffee to one or two early risers, scrolling market reports on tablets. Coop elevators consolidated. Repair shops closed as equipment grew too specialized for backyard mechanics. Each new leap in precision made local expertise obsolete. To urban outsiders, productivity meant prosperity. Grain exports hit records, meatpacking demanded endless feedlots, satellite data showed green fields pumping out wealth. But that wealth bypassed the places generating it. Fewer residents meant fewer local transactions, less demand for barbers, teachers, or waitresses. A harvest worth millions might funnel through a town whose only active business was its ATM. Isolation reshaped the identity of the farmer. The occupation once symbolized rugged independence and communal cooperation. Now it resembled remote management. Farmers talked about data analytics, cloud storage, and subscription software updates. Young operators described their work rhythm by download speed, not weather. A 21st-century farmer might start the day checking soil maps and end it troubleshooting a glitching sensor. The field still required sunlight, but the work required bandwidth. For older generations, the transformation felt bittersweet. Some adapted, proud of the precision tools their parents could never imagine. Others lamented that their grandchildren might learn coding instead of plowing. One Nebraska farmer said, "My granddad used a shovel, my dad used a tractor, I use an iPad." The next one might not need land at all. Automation shrank the meaning of locality. Production decisions once made at the kitchen table now responded to global algorithms calculating commodity prices in real time. Insurance formulas recommended what to plant and when. Bank software determined credit limits before a loan officer ever stepped foot on the farm. Technology gave control, yes, but also tethered every decision to distant systems invisible to those living among the wheat. Rural sociologists began noticing a new category of community, what they called virtual rurality. Neighbors interacted through online forums and precision farming discussion boards more than across fence lines. Churches live-streamed sermons for members too far or too busy to drive an hour into town. Even local friendships migrated to screens, measured in text threads, not shared labor. Yet the people who remained rarely described themselves as isolated. They described being efficient. They said automation let them stay when otherwise they might have left. And they were partly right. Without machines, many farms would have folded entirely. The land remained productive precisely because it no longer needed the population density that once kept towns alive. Still behind that practicality, a quiet ache persisted. Older farmers who remembered community harvests spoke of missing noise, the collective rhythm of engines and voices blending in fields. Now, each machine operated in sync with satellites, not song. On some farms, harvest celebrations were just a photo texted to relatives who lived hours away. The irony deepened when large corporations began managing regional operations remotely. Outsourcing appeared not just in manufacturing, but in farming itself. Contract growers received instructions from offices hundreds of miles away. What had once been deeply local, rooted in soil and family name, became part of global logistics. The plains had always exported grain, now it exported identity. Even success stories carried shadows. Massive yields masked economic fragility. High-tech machinery meant high debt, each combined costing more than a house. A system failure mid-season could stall progress across thousands of acres. When microchips replaced manpower, dependence on manufacturers replaced dependence on neighbors. If a sensor broke on a Sunday, you called tech support, not your cousin. You could watch it happen from any drone shot, the visual of triumph and emptiness intertwined. Giant arcs of perfectly spaced crops, miles long, curved around single farmhouses without smoke rising from neighboring chimneys. Aerial beauty disguising human absence. By the 202s, automation had finished what the dust and depression began. It made the Great Plains permanently post-human in scale. Machines tamed drought cycles through real-time irrigation, adjusted seeding against heat forecasts, and logged every variable in cloud servers far from the prairie. The land no longer required population to remain productive. It required code. Social life adapted in strange ways. Coffee groups met inside machine sheds. Farmers clustered around laptops comparing data sets instead of stories. High school FFA clubs held drone competitions instead of livestock shows. Marriage rates declined. Migration accelerated among youth chasing tech work in cities. The same ingenuity that kept farms alive drained people from them. But among those who endured, pride remained fierce. They saw themselves as pilots of the frontier's next chapter. Automation wasn't abandonment, it was evolution. If the land doesn't need us 9 months of the year, that's just progress, one Kansas operator said. Then, after a pause, he admitted, still feels lonely sometimes. Efficiency had conquered distance, but not emptiness. Machines had solved labor, but deepened silence. The Great Plains continued to feed the country, even as its heartbeat slowed to mechanical rhythm. Each autonomous pass of a combine recorded a paradox, the perfection of productivity achieved through subtraction. In the dark, under a harvest moon, the machinery lights blink in unison across the plains, tracing circles that never meet. From above, it looks like civilization thriving. From the ground, it sounds like one man talking to himself over the whir of engines and the whisper of endless wind. Section 7. The Return of Climate Extremes. The wind didn't forget its old path. By the dawn of the 21st century, it had found its rhythm again: hotter summers, drier winters, rains that arrived too late or all at once. Farmers watching the horizon swore they'd seen this before: air turning sharp, soil cracking early, sky thick with distant haze. Only this time, it wasn't just drought. It was change etched into the pattern of the planet itself. Satellite photos began to tell grim stories. Across Kansas and Oklahoma, reservoirs shrank into splinters of blue. In Texas, lakes that had once swallowed entire valleys became dust bowls again. Temperature records tumbled, replaced almost yearly by new highs. Scientists described the Great Plains as one of North America's fastest warming regions, its summers stretching longer, its cold snaps vanishing, replaced by violent hailstorms and spring floods that washed away topsoil overnight. For the families who remained, each decade blurred into another round of adaptation. They'd traded horses for tractors, pumps for pivots. Now those same pivots spun over thirsty ground as streams went intermittent. The Ogalala still pumped, but slower. The sound of irrigation at night, the steady hiss that once meant security, began to sound like desperation. In 2011, Texas entered one of its worst droughts since record-keeping began. Corn died standing. Dust clouds rolled across highways, not as black as the 193s, but driven by the same relentless wind. Ranchers sold off half their herds, feed costs tripled. Farmers cut irrigation to save electricity. That year, economists estimated over $7 billion in agricultural losses. The next year wasn't much better. Climate models confirmed what locals already felt in their bones. Extreme had become normal. For some, the memory of the Dust Bowl wasn't history, it was inherited instinct. Families who'd survived their grandparents' hardships read these signs with dread. Newspapers revived old headlines: another dirty 30s. But this wasn't a replay, it was an escalation. The storms carried more heat, the droughts lasted longer, and the seasons swung between too little and too much. Farmers adjusted planting calendars, gambling on when and where rain might strike. Some fields blossomed beautifully only to drown in a single deluge. Others failed 3 years straight. Insurance softened the blow, but payments couldn't replace trust in the land's rhythm. One Kansas grower said, "It's like farming roulette. Either we drown or we dust." Climate data tracked a clear drift. Yearly precipitation falling even as single-storm rainfall set new records. The land wasn't drying evenly, it was fracturing into extremes. In North Dakota, floods swallowed pastures. In western Kansas, wheat baked in the soil before tasseling. Seasonal predictability, the quiet calendar farmers depended on, was dissolving. Those who could afford it leaned on technology. Drones mapped soil moisture. Satellite apps guided every irrigation decision. Some fields experimented with drought-tolerant hybrids bred to survive temperatures 20 degrees above historical averages. Others switched back to sorghum, an old standby known for surviving where corn could not. But the shift came at a cost: lower yields, less income, fewer jobs. Survival meant scaling back, which only thinned communities further. Farmers shared uneasy jokes at co-op meetings: we should start planting cactus. Beneath the humor was anxiety. County by county, wells started failing again. New measurements showed parts of the Ogalala dropping by several feet each year. Hydrologists warned, "We're living on the bank account of the Ice Age, and we're almost overdrawn." The metaphor stuck because it was too accurate. Local governments began imposing limits through conservation districts, echoing 193's soil campaigns. Posters urged restraint: every drop counts. But restraint meant fewer irrigated acres, fewer profits, fewer reasons for young people to stay. The paradox tightened: save the water and lose the town, or use the water and accelerate the end. Beyond economics, the climate crisis pressed on psychology. Summer heat indexes climbed past 110 degrees F for days at a time. Nights no longer cooled enough to rest. Insurance companies quietly withdrew from high-risk zones, labeling counties uninsurable for crops they'd once guaranteed. Tornadoes shifted northward. Grassfires tore through counties previously considered safe. Each event was survivable on its own. Together, they signaled a region living on borrowed rhythm. The old idea that the plains were punishment for hubris resurfaced. Pastors referenced scripture about 7 fat years and 7 lean. Scientists spoke of carbon feedback loops. Farmers just looked at the cracked earth and said, "It's turning mean again." The emotional exhaustion ran deeper than statistics. It was personal. Extreme weather wasn't theoretical when it stole a harvest or broke a family's century-old bond to land. Still, resilience lingered like a rival faith. Town councils debated water tax districts. Co-ops pooled resources for new grain varieties that could mature faster in shorter seasons. Agronomists hosted field days demonstrating regenerative techniques, cover crops, minimal tillage, soil carbon retention. Some younger farmers embraced these ideas, blending tradition and innovation. A Nebraska operator said, "We can't outfight the sky, but we can learn to work with what's left." It was pragmatic hope, not naive optimism. Government policy oscillated between incentives and crisis aid. New federal programs funded climate-smart agriculture, while state universities deployed research drones to map evapotranspiration. Reports circulated about soil health as national security. To coastal audiences, it sounded abstract. To the Great Plains, it was survival. Energy projects offered patches of stability. The same wind that once destroyed livelihoods now powered turbines spinning megawatts into distant cities. Fields once barren now glimmered at night with red turbine lights. Lease payments helped struggling farms offset unpredictable harvests. Yet even those projects revealed contradiction. Wind crews came from elsewhere, stayed in motels, then drove away. Energy thrived, population did not. The land transformed again, from breadbasket to wind province. Climate extremes didn't only reshape farming, they reshaped identity. Children of farmers sought jobs in meteorology, engineering, computer science, fields that didn't need soil. At high school graduations, speeches once praising future generations of producers now blessed future innovators. The phrase carried quiet farewell. By 202, a series of mega droughts carved the southern high plains into zones of slow surrender. Satellite imagery showed deserts creeping north through Texas and Kansas. The U.S. Geological Survey warned of permanent conversion of farmland to grassland or brush. Some counties abandoned irrigation altogether, reverting to dryland pastures where cattle grazed among relic sprinklers. Even rain couldn't undo the shift. When it finally came, it ran off hardened soil, carving gullies wider than tractors. Residents adapted household habits too, capturing roof runoff, timing laundry to well recovery, installing cisterns like their great-grandparents once did. In that sense, the plains had come full circle. High-tech irrigation had been replaced by rain barrels and shared community wells. Progress looked like remembering. Debate over the region's future deepened. Should the Great Plains remain agricultural or evolve into an energy corridor and conservation biome? Environmentalists proposed rewilding sections, letting bison roam again, restoring native grasses. Economists countered that rural America couldn't survive on nostalgia. Most locals just wanted stability, whatever shape it took. One farmer watching a storm roll across the Dakotas put it simply, "We used to pray for rain, now we pray for balance." That prayer summed up the crisis and the hope. Balance between profit and preservation, between tradition and adaptation, between survival and surrender. As the century advanced, climate models projected sharper swings, multi-year droughts punctuated by catastrophic floods. Yet people still planted. They'd always planted. The act was both economy and defiance. When asked why he kept farming against the odds, a Kansas man shrugged, "Because my grandfather did, and the land hasn't told me to quit yet." Even in its harshest years, the Great Plains carried a strange beauty. Sunsets streaked mud cracks with gold, storm cells stacked like cathedrals, The horizon, unbroken and merciless, still promised something sacred about endurance. The lesson repeating through every generation became clear. Prosperity here is temporary, but belonging can be permanent, if you accept that permanence means living at the edge of hardship. The return of climate extremes didn't make the plains uninhabitable overnight. It simply revealed what had always been true, that survival here depends on humility. The wind is older than agriculture, older than memory, and entirely indifferent. Those who endure have learned not to fight it, but to stand still long enough to see where it's blowing next. Section 8. The renewable lifeline, wind and hope. Long before the turbines arrived, people joked the Great Plains had only two natural resources, wind and solitude. By the 200s, one of those finally started paying rent. Rising from wheat fields like a new species of crop, white towers began spinning where grain once bent to storms. Ranchers who'd spent their lives fearing the wind now welcomed it with contracts and lease checks. What used to flatten barns now powered economies. At first, it seemed almost poetic. The land's most relentless force turned into its salvation. Wind developers descended on counties starved for revenue. They offered landowners steady payments per turbine, $5,000 to $10,000 a year, numbers that dwarfed some annual crop profits. For families still nursing debts from droughts or irrigation costs, it felt like a miracle with concrete footings. Instead of praying for rain, they prayed for wind speeds above 12 miles per hour. Construction crews arrived in caravans of semi-trucks hauling blades the length of city blocks. Rural highways became temporary convoys of progress. Locals drove out to watch cranes lift towers into the sky, their silhouettes slicing horizons once unbroken for centuries. Children compared turbine heights to skyscrapers from New York postcards. For a few weeks, the plains buzzed again, motels full, diners open late, gas stations alive. Then, as quickly as they came, the workers left. What remained were the steady rotations, giant mechanical metronomes marking a new rhythm of rural life. Each tower whispered the same story, stability at last. Counties that had lost their factories or schools now boasted some of the state's highest property tax revenues. Those funds reopened libraries, paid for ambulance upgrades, patched roads long ignored. In Texas, clean energy funds even covered volunteer, fire trucks, and school laptop programs. The irony wasn't lost on residents, turbines educating children in towns without enough kids to fill a classroom. For many landowners, wind didn't replace farming, it underwrote it. Lease checks arrived regardless of rainfall. Farmers called it drought insurance that spins. A Kansas rancher smiled when asked about the noise complaints. "I don't hear turbines," he said, "I hear tuition payments." Across thousands of square miles, the wind became a second harvest, steady, invisible, dependable. Governments saw opportunity too. State legislatures courted developers with tax breaks, betting on jobs and modernization. In places like Iowa, Oklahoma, and South Dakota, wind surpassed all expectations, providing major shares of statewide electricity. National headlines began calling the Great Plains the Saudi Arabia of wind. The phrase sounded grand, even if it echoed the same paradox as oil: wealth extracted to fuel lives elsewhere. For towns on the edge of disappearance, the economic shock was brief but real. Construction booms brought temporary populations, filling rental homes long vacant. Cafes doubled sales, schools saw a fleeting uptick as workers' families passed through. The optimism felt tangible, a modern resemblance of the railroad era's excitement. But unlike railroads, wind farms didn't leave communities connected. Once the power flowed to distant cities, the people who managed it lived there too. A wind technician might work 50 miles from home, commuting to maintain turbines monitored by algorithms in Houston or Chicago. The energy stayed local only long enough to pass through transformers. Dollars traveled one way, up the grid, out to the coasts that always needed more power. Locals joked, "We export everything now, grain, kids, electricity." Those jokes carried more resignation than laughter. Still, the projects changed landscapes and identities. Old homesteads once missing from maps found renewed purpose as waypoints for wind coordinates. Farmers layered new infrastructure over old. Barbed wire, irrigation lines, now access roads curling toward steel columns. For outsiders, the turbines symbolized progress. For locals, they were just the latest reminder that the land evolves whether you're ready or not. Environmentalists celebrated the plains as a frontier of clean energy. Endless wind, endless space, minimal human interference. It was the perfect laboratory. Conservationists argued that turbines preserved open land by keeping farms viable, deterring suburban sprawl. Critics countered that turbines fractured wildlife habitat and turned rural panoramas into industrial backdrops. But for most residents, debates about aesthetics mattered less than whether their next power bill would land lower and their property taxes covered the county nurse's salary. The economics rippled through counties unevenly. Some became wind power superstars, Oldham County, Texas deriving over a fifth of its revenue from turbines. Others declined permits, unwilling to trade views for steel. Neighbor fought neighbor in zoning hearings about setback distances and shadow flicker. The same wind that united farmers under the sky now split them in boardrooms. Prosperity, once a shared harvest, turned contractual. Maintenance seasons created new occupations. Where small-town kids once learned welding to fix combines, they now trained for turbine climbing certifications. Vocational schools added renewable energy tracks. Young adults discovered reasons to stay, if not on the family farm, then in technician crews scaling 300-foot towers under rotating blades. The view from up there, they said, was the best in the county, earth curving, clouds sprinting. It felt powerful, but also lonely. Because wind power, for all its promise, didn't reverse the demographic tide. Turbines spun above fields worked by fewer hands than ever. Automation ran the farms, the wind ran itself. New wealth came without new neighbors. The population charts still pointed downward, even as the tax charts rose. Prosperity without presence that became the region's signature. One reporter called the Great Plains America's first post-human economy, sustained by invisible work. Superintendents credited turbine royalties for keeping lights on in half-empty schools. County clerks balanced budgets for the first time in years. Yet nobody was moving in. Survival no longer required residents, only resilience of infrastructure. Modern America had found a way to make rural land economically useful without the burden of people. The transformation extended beyond economics into imagination. Turbines replaced grain elevators as icons of the plains. From highway portraits and postcards to campaign ads touting innovation, the sleek towers became shorthand for hope. They shimmered at sunset like monuments to endurance, proof that the plains could evolve again. Visitors snapped photos, locals glanced up, then down at the empty streets feeding those clean megawatts outward. Not everyone welcomed them. Some complained of noise or blinking lights. Others saw them as visual proof of surrender, that farming had turned from sustenance to leaseholding. One rancher muttered, "We used to grow food for people, now we just power their screens." In that sarcasm lay the real paradox, success measured in electrons, not families. Still, calling it failure misses the nuance. For many, turbines brought a measure of peace. They didn't demand rain, debt, or youth. They asked only wind, which was guaranteed. The contract stretched 20 or 30 years, enough to fund retirements, enough to convince the next generation that maybe staying wasn't foolish. The Great Plains had found a way to remain relevant by becoming remote, a territory of quiet strength generating life for everywhere else. At night, standing beneath them, the sound is steady, a turbine's low hum blending with crickets and distant coyotes. Each rotation sends energy hundreds of miles away, carrying with it a faint echo of the land's persistence. From a distance, those red lights blinking in unison look like a constellation of survival, scattered across darkness the way old farmhouses once were. Wind didn't bring back the people. It brought permanence of another kind, a self-sustaining patience. The modern plains belongs to movement and silence at once, blades turning endlessly above towns that no longer need to grow to matter. The region may never again overflow with settlers or storefronts, but in every gust that spins those towers, there's proof it still matters. The land that once starved on unpredictability now lives on constancy, its energy measured not in wheat, but in wind. Section 9. The human cost of distance. The Great Plains has always challenged its people with distance, but somewhere between the last train whistle and the first cell tower, distance changed from geography into emotion. Today, it's not measured in miles between towns, it's the silence that fills the space those miles used to connect. The region still produces food, energy, and data, yet what it no longer produces, in abundance, our neighbors. The isolation creeps slowly. A grocery store closes, a school loses enrollment, a highway bypass diverts the last trickle of travelers who used to stop for pie and gas. The community doesn't collapse in a day, it fades, one unrenewed license, one boarded-up window at a time. Elderly residents stay out of familiarity or defiance, keeping lawns trimmed around houses now blocks apart. For them, home means permanence, even if permanence means solitude. One retired teacher in western Nebraska describes it like this: "You make friends with time." He delivers meals to older neighbors once a week. They talk mostly about weather and grandchildren they rarely see. Sometimes, weeks pass before he sees another car on the road to town. In these counties, friendship has become a logistical challenge, measured in tankfuls of gas and seasonal maintenance on gravel roads. Technology promised connection, but it delivered substitution. Broadband signals bridge the gap, yet the calls never replace human proximity. Birthdays are streamed, funerals are live posted. The same fiber lines that bring entertainment also bring a reminder of absence. The faces on screen framed by apartments and city skylines that the planes raised but no longer holds. In medical emergencies, distance turns lethal. Rural hospitals have vanished at record rates. Counties depend on volunteer EMTs who cover territories larger than some New England states. A heart attack or farm accident can mean a 40-minute wait. Even routine healthcare has become a matter of endurance, driving hours for checkups in cities where doctors still practice full-time. One Kansas nurse says she spends as much time on the road making house calls as she does in actual visits. It's healthcare by odometer, she jokes, but the laugh doesn't last long. Mental health shadows every conversation. Loneliness isn't just sadness, it's chemical stress compounded by isolation. The American Psychological Association lists rural Great Plains counties among the highest for depression and suicide risk. Pastors talk openly about funerals without congregations. Veterans returning from service find the emptiness disorienting after the noise of cities. "It's not that there's nothing here," one says quietly, "it's that there's no one here." Yet inside this quiet, an odd gratitude persists. People who remain often describe peace as fiercely as others describe prosperity. They talk about seeing the Milky Way unbroken, of hearing their own breath in the wind. For them, isolation is both burden and blessing, a trade-off they accept knowingly. One widow near the South Dakota border tends to her late husband's cattle alone, saying she stays because the stars are company enough. The children who leave rarely do so from disdain. They leave because the math stops adding up. Job opportunities, schools, and partners are all somewhere else. Families scattered across states maintain rituals of return, summer reunions, holidays on the farmstead, but each year fewer come back. When they do, they film the ruins with drones for nostalgia uploads. The land that once defined their upbringing now fits into digital archives of memory. Some towns experiment with survival through connection instead of expansion. Local libraries double as co-working hubs, drawing remote workers who crave quiet. Residents host virtual town halls where participants log in from hundreds of miles apart, but still call it the same meeting. Churches live stream sermons from sanctuaries surrounded by empty pews. Worship by Wi-Fi, the sacred has adapted to bandwidth. Despite these adaptations, the emotional economy remains fragile. Without density, every loss amplifies. When a single resident dies, it's like a library closing. They carried names, stories, and local memory, the oral architecture of place. A county may measure its population in hundreds, but resilience depends on dozens. When a few leave, the social microclimate shifts dramatically. The void grows colder. Living alone on this scale demands rituals. People turn chores into timekeepers, feeding livestock at dawn, watching weather radar at dusk. Mail delivery becomes social contact. The UPS driver knows everyone's dogs by name. People decorate abandoned buildings on holidays just to keep collective time going. It's not tradition, a rancher explains. It's proof we're still here. Economics themselves manifests emotionally. When a school shuts down, it erases not only education but belonging. Parents drive children to neighboring districts, stranding them between identities. They play for teams whose mascots they didn't choose, cheering against towns their grandparents helped build. The boundaries of community blur, replaced by necessity. And distance isn't only horizontal, it's generational. Parents still wake to the same horizons they grew up under. Their children wake to apartment walls hundreds of miles away. The prairie telephone calls at sunset. Did it rain there? It rarely did. Conversations fade into silence unfamiliar to younger ears accustomed to city hum. For all its hardship, the Great Plains still hosts resilience like nowhere else. Neighbors shovel each other's driveways though they live half a mile apart. Volunteer fire departments practice on weekends though half their members work 2 jobs. Teachers maintain after-school programs even with 4 students. Their endurance redefines community as effort, not proximity. A sociologist once called the plains a geography of waiting. That waiting shows in every conversation here. Waiting for rain, for kids to visit, for someone to answer a classified ad for a house that's been empty since 1998. Waiting for a future that might never refill the space. Yet the act of waiting itself becomes identity, a refusal to yield fully to decline. Loneliness produces unexpected philosophies. Talk long enough with any resident and you'll hear a version of frontier stoicism. You can't control the wind, but you can build a better fence. Pragmatism tinged with poetry. They understand what urban America often forgets, that civilization doesn't always look crowded. Sometimes it's just endurance lived quietly under vast skies. Still, the cost accumulates. Population loss means political invisibility. Representation shrinks, funding dwindles, and policymakers treat the plains like empty land instead of hollow land. The difference matters. Hollow things once had form. People here carry that memory like an inheritance. Town charters, faded school banners, ledgers listing once thriving businesses. The archives become family trees. The younger generation, balancing nostalgia and necessity, see themselves as custodians of disappearance. A 20-something rancher admits on camera, "I don't know if my grandkids will live here, but I hope they'll understand why I did." Her words echo across miles of wind and wheat, part confession, part defense. And yet beauty lingers in the silence. The horizon at dusk, fields shifting shades of gold to violet, turbines blinking in rhythm with distant storms. Coyotes answer one another across canyons where engines went mute decades ago. It isn't emptiness so much as space reclaimed by time. The land feels honest again, demanding, sometimes cruel, but real. Residents adapt their hearts to distance the way pioneers once adapted wagons to ruts. They distribute emotion like resources, carefully, efficiently, never wasting contact. When someone moves in, it's cause for celebration. When they stay, it's considered a small miracle. The Great Plains was supposed to represent conquest, a triumph of settlement over wilderness. Instead, it teaches humility. Every efficiency stripped from it, machines, turbines, automation, made human presence rarer but also more meaningful. The people still here understand that survival isn't about crowds or convenience. It's about commitment to a place that asks everything and gives silence in return. So when dusk falls and the last trucklight fades beyond the horizon, what remains isn't tragedy but testimony. Distance holds them apart, but also binds them together in shared endurance. The land, vast and indifferent, has become mirror and companion. Out here, community is no longer defined by proximity, but by persistence. The quiet pledge that as long as one light still burns across the prairie, the Great Plains hasn't finished speaking. Section 10. The Paradox of Plenty. The Great Plains still feeds hundreds of millions of people each year. Grain from Kansas fills bread aisles in New York. Beef from Nebraska and Texas lands on plates halfway around the world. Wind energy from Iowa and Oklahoma powers digital lives thousands of miles away. By every measure of productivity, food, fuel, energy, the region has never been stronger. And yet, there's nobody left to see it happen. That's the paradox. The land produces abundance by driving away the very people who once made abundance possible. This isn't a story of failure, but of efficiency. For 200 years, progress meant learning how to wrest more output from less input. Every innovation that saved time or water or labor also trimmed one more human from the equation. Railroads once tied isolated towns together, automation untied them. Turbines hum where schools once rang with voices. The plains succeeded itself into absence. Geography plays its part, stubborn as ever. Vastness was always both gift and curse. The same distance that once offered freedom now multiplies costs. The soil remains rich, but the rain and population fall unevenly. On maps, counties look enormous, yet their tax revenues barely cover road maintenance. Sparsity magnifies every storm, every expense, every mile. Technology could flatten the earth, but it could never shrink space. Culturally, the emptiness carries contradiction. The plains invented cooperation through necessity, barn raisings, co-ops, shared wells. Now success depends on solitude and satellite data. The measure of accomplishment isn't how many people you can feed around your own table, but how many millions your field can feed abroad. Human value became statistical, not communal. You can produce record yields without witnessing gratitude, only market prices ticking on screens. Economists call it rational scaling, maximize output, minimize footprint. But on the Great Plains, that arithmetic translated into demographic erosion. Towns turned into service nodes, distribution points for commodities, not communities. At night, the glow on the horizon doesn't come from street lamps or porch lights. It comes from wind farms sending electricity east, from grain elevators running compressors in automated silos. Illumination without habitation. The more successful the region became economically, the less it needed people physically. Water pumps run on timers, irrigation pivots on sensors, cattle feeding on programmed schedules. Labor once scattered across families now compresses into single operators controlling fleets of machines. Prosperity detached from population altogether. It's the rare place where progress and disappearance share the same trajectory line. Some call it tragic, locals often shrug. They've heard versions of that lament since the first census dip. In their view, the plains simply evolved. Survival no longer means towns clustered 10 miles apart. It means networks of equipment spread across half a state. It's easy to misread quiet as decline when it's really adaptation expressed in silence. But the silence still hurts. Social density forged meaning for centuries. People define success through others, the handshake, the shared harvest, the church service where voices mingle. You can't mechanize belonging. As communities thin, rituals vanish. County fairs fold, newspapers condense to online notices, children grow up without seeing a parade. The land may thrive, but its human culture erodes grain by grain. The paradox deepens in policy debates. Federal planners celebrate renewable milestones, calling the Great Plains central to national energy independence. Wildlife advocates praise prairie restoration, noting how reduced human footprint benefits ecosystems. Economists marvel at efficiency metrics. Each success story, true in its domain, hides a human shadow, empty classrooms, closed clinics, and long stretches of highway maintained for the few who remain. Environmentally, the plains prospers by reverting toward what it was before settlement. Socially, it pays for that balance in people. Standing at the edge of a wheat field in midsummer, you see perfection. Waves of gold bending under wind, horizon infinite, sky vast enough to swallow language. Then you realize no sound accompanies it, no tractors droning, no laughter, no dogs barking. Only the whoosh of wind through endless crop. Productivity at peace with isolation. It's beautiful and haunting and entirely efficient. Climate and economics together cement this outcome. As water scarcity deepens and costs rise, consolidation continues. 20 small farms become one mega operation. Each transition saves resources but eliminates families. The Ogallala's slow depletion doesn't just dictate crop choices, it dictates demographics. When irrigation fades, dryland systems replace it, needing even fewer workers. Sustainability on paper looks like vacancy on the ground. Wind energy compounds it. Clean power demands space and constancy, both plentiful here. But turbines require maintenance, not neighbors. Their pulse replaces community with continuity, the hum of machines that never sleep, owned by corporations that rarely visit. The plains now exports electrical current the way it once exported grain, both flowing outward, both stripping presence from origin. This evolution challenges how we define habitation itself. If the measure of a region's vitality rests on population, then the Great Plains seems failed. But if it's measured by output, adaptability, and endurance, it's thriving. The dilemma isn't choosing which metric to trust, it's acknowledging that both can be true simultaneously. Prosperity has outgrown humanity's footprint. Residents feel that tension daily. They live inside graphs that point down while production charts climb up. Their kids move to cities lit by the energy they help produce. Their crops feed families whose addresses they'll never know. It's interdependence recast as distance. A farmer in Nebraska summed it simply, "We give what the world needs, but the world doesn't need us here to give it." Urban observers often mistake that honesty for despair. It's something else entirely, a pragmatic serenity born from centuries of adaptation. The people who endure understand the plains will outlast them. They measure meaning not in population growth, but in stewardship, keeping the soil alive for whoever or whatever comes next. In that sense, absence becomes form of legacy. The horizon can stay empty if the land beneath it continues to function. Nature seems to agree. As human footprints fade, pronghorn return to open ranges, wildflowers reclaim ditches abandoned by county crews. Wind sweeps grit into new dunes like half-formed memorials to forgotten towns. Ecologists call it rewilding. Locals call it simply the way it was. The landscape, once carved into private property lines, resumes its older geometry, fluid, silent, and self-sustaining. The paradox of plenty isn't accident, it's culmination. Every era of the Great Plains built toward this equilibrium between productivity and vacancy. The homesteaders sought to fill space. Their descendants perfected how to use it without being used up by it. The region finally achieved what it subconsciously aimed for all along: self-sufficiency divorced from density. The cost might be emptiness, but emptiness has always been the plains' native language. To outsiders, this transformation reads like decline. To those who live it, it's transcendence, the realization that thriving doesn't always look crowded. The land remains alive, efficient, generous in yield and stubborn in temperament. Humans carved their ambition into its surface, and now that ambition lives on in turbines, pumping stations, and code. Progress here no longer walks on two legs, it whirs, rotates, and transmits. When night falls, red turbine lights blink across miles of prairie like measured heartbeats. Each one marks a paradox resolved and renewed, a landscape producing more life than it contains. The Great Plains feeds nations, powers cities, and teaches humility simply by existing. Its emptiness isn't loss, it's the visible cost of mastery, the calm that follows every conquest trying to become coexistence. And as dawn rises over fields that hum with unseen motion, the lesson crystallizes. The Great Plains didn't fail to sustain people. People failed to accept the terms. Geography was never conquered, it endured, quietly proving that abundance and isolation can share the same soil, and that sometimes the truest prosperity lives where the fewest voices remain. The Great Plains wasn't conquered, it's being outlasted. Its story isn't one of defeat, but of endurance measured in absence. Under turbines and satellites, the land keeps working, indifferent to how many hands remain to guide it. The emptiness that unsettles outsiders feels natural here. Geography asks less of people now because it has learned to manage without them. That's not tragedy, it's balance restored. Across these counties, silence has become a language again. Winds that once drove settlers away now deliver power to cities that barely notice their source. The grain still ships, the lights still glow, the world still eats. Yet every success reminds us whose presence was traded for efficiency. The irony is simple and powerful. The Great Plains can feed millions, but sustain almost no one. Progress replaced neighbors with networks, rooted lives with remote grids. What remains is proof that geography outlasts every dream to master it. Resilience here means knowing when to stay and when to let the wind have its way, because this landscape keeps its own time, its own patience. As you stand beneath that endless sky, you understand what settlers, farmers, and engineers all learned too late. Survival here was never about victory, it was about acceptance. For more stories exploring the places progress forgot, and the histories still hidden in silence, subscribe and watch our next deep dive.